All right, algebra class, welcome to our first virtual algebra lesson. It's so good to see that you're all logging in trying to do your work. As a reminder, we left off toward the end of Unit 7, where we were learning about polynomials, and in the second half of the unit, we were learning about the different types of factoring. So in today's lesson, our learning target is I can factor polynomials by using one or more of the 5 methods of factoring. So again, at this point in the year, we've learned 5 different methods of trying to factor, and today we're going to be reviewing those different methods. We're going to start today by looking at this do now question. It said, which student correctly factored the expression? So our expression was 4y squared minus 16y plus 16. So I want you to take a minute to look at these two expressions. I would pause the video right here so you can decide which student did this correctly. Okay, so after looking at this, it is true that both students actually did a correct method of factoring. Our student on the left used our method of a trinomial when a is greater than 1, also called the AC method, where you multiply the a and the c terms, you split the middle term, and then you factor by grouping. However, this student did not do what's called factoring completely, which means that you have factored until you cannot factor anymore. So that would make the student on the right the student that is correct. If you look at this student's work, they first took out the GCF. The GCF of 4, 16, and 16 is 4. After they took out that 4, then they were left with a trinomial where a is equal to 1, where we simply ask ourselves what multiplies to c and adds to b. And those two numbers that they came up with were -2 and -2. So the final answer is 4, y minus 2, y minus 2. So again, this student on the left here did factor, but they did not factor completely. Okay, so moving into our lesson for today, the first thing, like I said, that we're trying to do is review the different types of factoring. And at this point in the year, we've actually learned 5 different types of factoring. So the first type that we learned is just looking for a GCF, meaning the only thing that you can do is take out a greatest common factor. Then the next type of factoring we learned about was factor by grouping, which is when you have 4 terms in your expression, you group them by factoring out the GCF, and you factor completely. We then got into 2 different types of trinomial factoring. Our first was trinomial when a was just equal to 1, so that invisible 1 out front. And the second was trinomials also, but now this is when a was not equal to 1 or some other number besides 1. And the last type of factoring that we looked at right before we left for being quarantined at home was the dots method of factoring, which again stands for the difference of squares. So what we're going to do right now is try to identify from these expressions down on the bottom of the page. You notice we have 12 of them. We're going to try to decide which method of factoring would you use for each. So at this point, I would stop the video and try to see if you can sort these into the different methods. Okay, so starting first by trying to pick out some of the easier ones, I'm going to start with dots factoring. As you can see, for dots factoring, you need to have only 2 terms. They both must be subtracted from each other, and they should be perfect squares. So of these expressions on the bottom, I can identify that x squared minus 64, I would use the dots method of factoring, as well as 9p to the 4th minus 100. Again, noticing that both of these have 2 terms being subtracted from each other, and they're both perfect squares. Looking for factor by grouping, which is when I have 4 terms, I notice that this happens in my first expression I have here and my second expression right here. Again, notice that those are the only expressions that have 4 terms in which I can use factor by grouping. Now we get into trinomial when a equals 1 and a is not 1. So my trinomials where a is equal to 1 include the following expressions: x squared plus 13x plus 36, x squared minus x minus 56, and also x squared plus 2x plus 2. Looking for trinomials when a is not 1, I notice I have the expression starting with 20x cubed, I also have the expression starting with 16p squared, the one with 2x squared, and also 6x squared. So notice that all of the ones circled in blue and red are all trinomials. Some are when a equals to 1, some are when a is not equal to 1. And finally, we're left with this last expression in the bottom right-hand corner here. Now, this expression doesn't really fit into any of these categories. I can't use dots because I see addition. There's only 2 terms, so it can't be trinomial or grouping, which must mean that this one I can only look for a GCF. There's nothing else I can do for this type of factoring. So again, we can see here that we've reviewed our different methods of factoring. Now what we're going to do is get into our practice. So what I'd like you to do right now is pause the video. This is going to be your independent work time. I want you to find the worksheet that was uploaded called Factoring Mixed Review. This worksheet is going to have 10 problems on it in which you're asked to factor completely, and then also identify which method or methods of factoring you used. So again, if we go back to our methods here, we've learned 5 different methods of factoring. So I want you to try to use one or multiple of these methods in your factoring practice. So go ahead right now. I want you to pause this video, identify the problems from the Factoring Mixed Review worksheet, and then come back to this video when you're ready to check your answers. If you're looking to challenge yourself, you can see we have some extension problems there. Those come from your regular factoring packet that we were working with in school when we last saw each other. So again, at this point, I would like you to pause the video, go work on the Factoring Mixed Practice worksheet, and then come back here to check your answers. Okay, so at this point, you should only be coming back to this video if you've completed the worksheet. Here are your answers for the worksheet. I'm going to just scroll through this a little bit quickly, so go ahead and pause the video when you want to check your work. Again, the final answers are boxed, and then I put with a little star under each problem the type of factoring I used. So here are your answers for questions 1 through 4. And scrolling down, here are your answers for 5 through 10. So you'll notice of all these 10 problems, they were pretty straightforward, except for number 9. In number 9, you had to use 2 methods of factoring because you were first having to take out that GCF of 2. So that's GCF factoring. Then, once you took that out, you were left with a trinomial where A is not 1, and you use the AC method, split the middle term, and then factor by grouping. So notice in that method, you needed to use 2 different types of factoring. If you have any questions about any of these problems, please reach out to any of the 4 of us for some extra help. So to wrap up this lesson, I want us to think about these 2 questions right here. I'm going to ask you to pause the video and try to answer these questions independently. Okay, so our first question was, what should you always look for first when factoring? Now this comes back to what we reviewed in our do now, which is that you should always look for a greatest common factor. If you take that out first, it will make your life so much easier. So no matter what type of factoring you're doing, I would like you to always first look for that GCF that you can factor out front. Our second question is, how can you check your work to make sure that you have factored correctly? So for this, we've learned that the way we can always check our work is by foiling. We also know that if it was just regular GCF factoring, you could distribute, and you should end up, after you either foil or distribute, by getting back to what you started with. Okay, so this concludes our first virtual lesson on factoring mixed practice. Please go back into the classwork page to see what other assignments you've been assigned to work on.